What just happened in Kursk? Why is the Ukrainian army suddenly capable of maneuver warfare? We have been told for 2 years about positional stalemate and a transparent battlefield where drones and artillery are rampant, making it impossible for large forces to maneuver without being detected from above. But, nevertheless, the Ukrainians managed to move large number of men and equipment near the Russian border and then undertake a blitzkrieg of sorts into Kursk, which caught the Russians flat-footed. The Ukrainians did indeed begin a maneuver war, where they hit a weak section of the Russian front, and they used well-thought-out tactics to breach Russian defenses. A key element of Ukrainian success in Kursk was the effective interaction of electronic warfare systems, drones, artillery, and mobile teams. Russian fire suppression allowed Ukrainian engineering equipment to make passages through minefields and dragon's teeth. And through these holes, wheeled armored vehicles rushed deep into the Russian defense, managing to drive 15 to 20 kilometers quickly, wreaking havoc in the Russian rear. At the same time, the Ukrainians made heavy use of radio-electronic warfare stations, drones, and manpads, along with light air defense systems in the forward units, making these units a difficult target for the Russians. By seizing the initiative and having an advantage in the pace of advance, the Ukrainians were able to choose positions for ambushes and surprise attacks. As a result, while conducting an offensive operation at the operational level, at the tactical level the Ukrainians often fought defensive battles, the place and time for which they themselves chose. It is obvious that this Ukrainian operation was conducted in line with the latest developments of American military doctrine, namely the doctrine of multi-domain operations. The essence of the multi-domain operation is that the object of attack is not only the enemy's armed forces, but also the entire environment in which they operate. Multi-domain operations combine classical warfare with cyber attacks, information and psychological operations and control in cyberspace. And this is exactly what the Ukrainian armed forces did in their attack on Kursk. American fingerprints are all over this invasion. On August 8, at the end of the first 24 hours of the invasion, the infrastructure of mobile operators in the Kursk region was subjected to the most powerful cyber attack. At this point, civilian communications were critical not only for evacuating civilians, but also for interaction between military units, since the Ukrainians had overwhelmed military communications with their EMP, and all communication was only able to go through personal devices. The Ukrainians also monitored troop movements through online cameras of Russian residents found on their properties. From the first hours of the invasion, the Ukrainians used terror tactics and attacked civilians, systematically shooting cars with fleeing refugees on the roads. The purpose of such tactics was to force local residents to stay in their homes in order, on the one hand, to make it more difficult for Russian aircraft to strike at Ukrainian units in populated areas, and on the other hand, to make it easier for the Ukrainians to take hostages. It is usual for Ukrainians to use civilians as human shields. But by the third day the tactics of the Ukrainians changed. The Center for Information and Psychological Operations of Ukraine began to encourage a large-scale flight of the population from areas where there was no fighting. Ukrainians pretending to be officers of the Russian armed forces made calls to local residents, and disinformation on social networks grew rampant. The strikes on the Kursk nuclear power plant were also necessary for the Ukrainians in order to sow chaos and panic, thus disorganizing the situation in the rear for Russian units trying to put together a defense. The tactic of a rapid breakthrough on wheeled armored vehicles gave the Ukrainians a significant advantage at the initial stage of the operation, but it also gave them significant problems. Their advance was dependent on roads. And because the Ukrainians were moving fast, they left many places for the Russians to set up ambushes in the Ukrainian rear. However, freeing Kursk from the Ukrainians is going to go slowly, because the Russians seriously underestimated Ukrainian strength. There was also the false sense of triumph that has pervaded much of Russia, given the endless failures of Ukraine on the battlefield. What is going on right now is an ambush war in the Kursk forests, although the Ukrainians are trying to bring in tanks and large-caliber artillery. The reality is that the Ukrainians amassed large forces and prepared a very capable battle group, which was generously supplied with the deadliest of Western weapons, and effectively trained by the West. Most likely, the Ukrainian bridgehead will gradually shrink and cling to the border of the Sumy region, which will come at the cost of heavy losses, as happened at the bridgehead in Krinky. The attack on Kursk, a full-fledged general military operation, was carefully planned, prepared and supported by cyber operations and psychological attacks, which points to the US and NATO. And the Ukrainians achieved their goal of forcing the Russians to transfer forces from the Donetsk region to the north. And this is not counting the huge number of munitions now being used inside Russia by Russians in order to demolish fortifications set up by the Ukrainians. Further, Russia has now created a special unit, equivalent to 7 army brigades, which only means that the fight can be taken into Ukraine's Sumy region. In other words, Ukraine's success in Kursk has given it yet another active front, which it will have to now defend, while it loses on all the other fronts it is fighting on. But there is also the possibility that Ukraine will strike elsewhere, such as the Bryansk region. In other words, that Ukraine actually wants to create as many fronts as possible to stretch thin Russian capabilities. Ukraine has long committed to total war and is generously supplied and supported by the West, and it still has a large reserve of men, not to mention mercenaries. On the other hand, Russia must look after its economy and its society, and therefore it cannot commit to total war. And yet it must still win the war. That is Russia's true dilemma. Because of this fundamental difference between Ukraine and Russia, the conflict between the two is now far more complex and variable, and a resolution will not come anytime soon on the battlefield. And in all this is the active role of the CIA, which has promised a campaign of terrorism inside Russia. How Russia handles all this is key. It can simply push the Ukrainians back across the border, and then do nothing else. It can corral and completely destroy the Ukrainians inside Kursk. Or, it can begin a systematic campaign of destroying all the centers of command inside Ukraine so this never happens again. Time will tell how Russia responds to this incursion into its territory. But it will also have to ready itself for fighting along more fronts. Such is the plan of the US for this conflict. A war on different fronts, including terrorism inside Russia. The Kursk invasion was the opening gambit to a new phase of this war.